Hello, my name is Clare Hillshafer, and today I will be presenting a brief summary of the research article titled Pitch-Catch Active Sensing Methods in Structural Health Monitoring for Aircraft Structures by authors Dr. Im and Dr. Chang. Before I start, here's a brief outline which includes what I will be talking about today. I will go over the background, introduction, techniques, experimental setup, results, and conclusions of this study. Structural health monitoring is a rapidly emerging field that involves AI sensor technology built into structures like buildings and various aircraft to closely monitor the current state of its conditions. This area of study uses complex algorithms to continuously oversee and monitor structures for damage to help improve factors like reliability, safety, performance and operation, as well as elongate its lifetime. Currently, traditional structural health monitoring methods fail to quantify the severity of the damage and important information like size and location of damage in composite aircraft structures. This is because composite materials consist of various alignment in its fibers, and no two composites are the same in terms of its anisotropy. This is dangerous in the sense that it becomes difficult to estimate the aircraft's lifetime, when it needs maintenance, and most importantly, when the structure becomes unsafe to fly. This is where this study comes in. The authors of this research article conducted multiple experiments to gain more knowledge about potentially using active sensor technology in aircraft structures made of composite materials. This will help to identify the size and location of damage, as well as its severity within the aircraft structure, to overall enhance its life cycle and safety. Active sensors use piezoelectric or PZT sensors that consist of both transmitters and receivers to monitor local damage over a large area. The authors in this study explore methods in quantifying the severity as well as pinpointing the size and location of the damage along the composite material of an aircraft structure. The first method that will be explored is called the damage index method. This method involves using pairs of transmitters and receivers to quantify the severity of the damage that is present. This method compares the change in the sensor measurements from a base or control test to the damaged material. The second method studied in this article is the diagnostic imaging method. This method measures and records how the waves sent out by the transmitters reflect, refract, or scatter off from the damage and are recorded by the receivers. This technique involves continuous imaging to understand the size and location of the damage based off of what waves the receivers capture. The authors in this study conduct multiple experiments that it gets a little confusing to keep track. This next slide provides an expanded view of what tests are conducted and for which method to help keep track of how this research article, as well as this presentation, is organized. Here we have our goal, determining damage in composite aerospace structures. Branching out from there, we have our two methods. The first is the damage index method. The experiment conducted for this method involves measuring the scattered waves generated by land waves and comparing them to a baseline control test. The authors go into a little bit more depth in regard to the diagnostic imaging method. They conduct a total of 4 tests. 2 of these tests using aluminum material and the other 2 using a composite material. Both materials include an added mass test. However, for the aluminum plate, a simulated crack test is used, and for the composite plate, a biaxial loading test is used. And I will go more in depth, including more detail about what all these tests incorporate later in this presentation. First, we'll start with the damage index method. This method or technique uses the change in sensor measurements from a healthy thin plate to a plate that contains damage, such as cracks or debonding. This will theoretically highlight the area of damage based on where the propagating signals are affected by the local damage. These changes in measurements are then compared to the probability of detection to ensure feasibility. The equation below is used to calculate the damage index based on the measurements collected from the experiment. Moving on to the diagnostic imaging method, this technique involves measuring the reflected, refracted, or scattered waves that are caused from the damage and sent back to the receiver. Using multiple transmitter and receiver pairs will result in a more accurate reading. This is because then waves can be sent out and bounce back from all directions, giving us a complete view of the damage present. This idea of echolocation, essentially, is the main approach for all these experiments. The authors conducted a total of 4 tests for this method. 2 of the tests use aluminum plates, and the other 2 tests use a composite plate. To start with the aluminum plate experiment, the first test conducted uses a circular mass bonded to the surface layer of the plate. Once the mass is secured, signals can be sent out and reflected back and recorded. The simulated crack test uses an artificial crack to be imposed on the plate, and the waves that are scattered and measured will be able to highlight the location and size of the damage. The other 2 tests use a composite plate. The same added mass test is conducted as previously used for the aluminum plate. And the final test is the biaxial loading test. This involves exerting cyclic loading on the composite plate to stretch the material until failure occurs. The specimen is then tested by sending out waves and measuring what is scattered back to visualize the size and location of the crack. The experimental setup for the damage index method involved 2 identical aluminum single lap joint plates. 2 artificial cracks were placed on 2 rivets. The plates then experienced tensile loading. 18 PZT sensors were attached with a smart layer technique. This technique evenly distributes a sensor network across the thin plate to send out signals from all directions. The receivers are placed directly across the transmitters to measure the crack size that is present. The setup for this experiment can be seen in the figure on the left that displays the distribution of transmitters and receivers along the plate, as well as the location of where the cracks are. The results were compared to the probability of detection to determine the accuracy of this method. The experimental setup for the added mass test on the aluminum plate involved 4 PZT sensors arbitrarily placed anywhere on the aluminum plate. First, a control test was implemented to have a base measurement of how the waves interact with the material. Then, a circular mass made of bronze, with the dimensions shown, is bonded to the center. The test is then repeated, and the change in wave measurements created a visual to highlight the size and location of the added mass. The simulated crack test uses the same plate dimensions and control test. However, this time, an electric discharge machining system created cracks within the aluminum plate. Similar to the added mass test, the change in wave measurements were recorded and compared. Then, a digital image was taken to compare the results gathered to the actual extent of the damage. The setup for the composite material was relatively the same as the aluminum plate, in which a smart layer technique applied 30 PZT sensors evenly across the plate. A base test without any damage was ran to later be used to compare the results that the damage made. The added mass test was run the same way as previously described in the last slide for the aluminum plate. The biaxial loading test involves cyclic loading the plate in the x and y directions of a coordinate plane until failure occurred. This damage was then tested the same way as the simulated crack test discussed in the last slide. Finally, a C-scan ultrasonic image was taken to compare the results measured to a visual taken of the damage. The results of the damage index test showed that this method can effectively determine the severity of a crack size between 5 and 25 millimeters. Any bigger and the tolerance becomes too low and the measurements are inaccurate. Additionally, a positive linear relationship was determined between the size of the crack present and the damage index, where the larger the crack size, the larger the damage index. This can normally be inferred, that the bigger the damage, the larger the severity. But this linear relationship that has occurred gives additional proof that this method is successful in determining the severity of a damage in a material. The results of the added mass test for the aluminum plate resulted in a successful approach to estimate the size and location of specific damage. In the simulated crack test, the results illustrated that this technique can easily highlight the damage over a large plate area. Meanwhile, for the composite plate test, the added mass test results showed that the imaging is okay, but the different wave velocities can cause large errors and cause an inaccurate illustration of the location and size of the damage. Lastly, the biaxial loading test showed that this test was successful in pinpointing the extent of the damage. The authors confirmed this study by comparing the images they collected with a C-scan ultrasonic image. The figure to the right is of the results of the added mass test from the aluminum plate. As you can see, an estimation of the size and location from the added mass test was very accurate as compared to the actual location and size of the added mass. In conclusion, the damage index method proved to be just as successful and accurate. However, the main issue that developed is that the location of the PZT sensors are very important. These sensors need to be located close to the damage to receive more accurate results. That becomes a problem because to apply this method in the real world, these sensors are supposed to be arbitrarily placed to detect any damage that occurs, measure the severity, and signal the user, not for the user to find damage and then use this method to understand the severity. The diagnostic imaging method proved to be successful in this experiment and can illustrate the size and location of the damage easily over a large surface area. Main areas of improvement in the study is finding a way to increase the resolution of the image. Lastly, finding a way to filter out environmental factors like the boundaries of the structure, turbulence, and human interaction. Thank you very much for your attention.